that it will be something that we can all work through together and see sort of some ideas about where we're going. Some of these things don't have answers, and we're in the process of developing answers for the questions that the staffing changes raise. And the more people that are involved in this, both from those who are watching today and the public, the better. Because frankly, some of these are uncharted territory for all of us, and we're going to need to leverage as many partners and as many ideas as possible in order to make these changes work for all of us and maintain safety in this city that we love so much. So I'll start off. I am Deputy Chief Jonathan Murad. I'm the Acting Chief of Police here at the Burlington Police Department, and this is a presentation about the Burlington Police Department's staffing, its past, its present, and its future. In June, on June 29th of this year, the Burlington City Council passed a racial justice through economic and criminal justice resolution. And among its many prescriptions was a requirement that the Burlington Police Department diminish its staffing through attrition. That has been ongoing. We have been seeing officers depart, and we are not rehiring those officers after they do depart. And that has certain implications for how we are able to continue to provide services when we're called. Before we start talking about staffing, I think it's important for us to be able to look at the nature of what staffing takes to get staffed. So recruiting and hiring is something that we need to focus on a little bit at first, just so that it's in the back of everyone's minds as we talk about our headcount. Recruiting and hiring is a long process, from the academy to the field training process, from the pre-hire process. The total time for an officer to apply to the Burlington Police Department, go through our various hiring processes, go through our various training processes, and be a solo officer on the road is about 14 months in the best case scenario. That is, if everything hits and we get it all through exactly in the timing that we're allotted. And that is not always the case. We don't always make the perfect timing, and we also don't always get officers through the entire process. We lose a lot of officers in the pre-hire process because they don't meet standards that we have and we want to continue to have. We lose officers sometimes in our training processes, whether it's at the police academy or during our field training process, which is one of the longest in the state. And we want that rigor and vigor in our training processes because we want to make sure that our officers are as well equipped for the very difficult job that lays in front of them as possible. Of our last class, out of 260 applicants, 6 were hired and sent to the Vermont Police Academy, and only 3 graduated. It's been mentioned before that we also have the ability to hire what are called lateral police officers. Those are people who are already police officers in other states or level 3 police officers here in Vermont. That process is obviously a lot shorter than 14 months, but it too takes 6 to 7 months, and COVID has currently made that a longer process than it was in the past. Frankly, as well, with regard to some of the things that we'll be talking about in this presentation, the idea of in-state laterals becomes unlikely. We are not necessarily an agency that is attracting officers to us in-state, but there is a path forward where we could become such an agency again. Our current staffing. Our current staffing is currently down 15% from our previous average sworn staffing levels of about 96 over the past 8 years to 82. 81. We actually had a resignation 2 days ago. And that officer left, as other officers did, because of statements in their exit paperwork that city council decisions played a role in those departures. We are seeing that those departures are accelerating, and we anticipate seeing others. But we currently have 81 sworn personnel, and that's effective personnel. And there are a couple distinctions there. Sworn personnel includes all members of our department who are level 3 certified police officers, according to the state of Vermont. We also have many very, very important civilian personnel. We have dispatchers, we have records clerks, we have social workers, we have community service officers. We have a number of incredibly important civilian positions that make this department run. But insofar as the staffing issues and those associated with our inability to hire and the prohibition on hiring, that refers only to sworn police officers level 3. Sometimes in this report, we talk about overall sworn staffing numbers, and sometimes we're talking specifically about officers. that is non-supervisory officers who do the bulk of our patrol response, who are our detectives, who are the officers who are deployed at our airport and keep that safe. So at times we're talking about the total number of sworn officers, which includes supervisors, and at times we're talking about specific officers who are police officers and are deployable. Effective is a term meaning that I have some officers on our books right now who are long-term injured or long-term sick that will never return to work. And those are officers who are not deployable. I have officers who are still on our books but are on long-term military deployments for a year or more. Those are not deployable officers. We have one officer who recently tendered his tenured retirement. That is not a resignation, but a retirement because he's hit 20 years, but he's actually got a little bit of time on the books that is burning. He's still on our books, but he's not deployable because he's no longer effectively employed by this agency. So that's what effective means. Staffing going forward. Going forward, we anticipate dropping more quickly before the next tour from 81 to 79. So we structure our year for patrol in tours. They are 4-month-long shifts in which officers choose their assignment based on seniority, and we then deploy them accordingly to a day shift, to a midday shift or an evening shift, to a midnight shift. We don't currently have a midday shift or swing shift owing to our staffing levels, which are lower than they've been in the memory of really anyone who's currently employed in the agency. We have to go back into the 80s to see numbers that are as low as what we're currently at. Patrol and the shifts there need really 41 to 42 officers to function normally. We also, of course, have officers who are assigned to the airport, as I said before. We have officers who are assigned in specialized positions, the roles that really make this police department function in the way that we have striven to function with regard to community policing and community service. And we have officers assigned to our detective bureau. Our next tour begins on January 3rd, 2021. And we anticipate additional departures that are not encountered in this 81 effective figure. We know that one officer is slated to begin a military deployment of more than a year. We know that one officer is in the hiring process for the Vermont State Police and will likely start that job in December. We have 2 additional officers who we expect to have deployed on long-term military deployments. We have another officer who is in the hiring process for the DEA. And we have many officers who may be called up for shorter spans of military deployment with regard to potential operations involving vaccine distribution here in the state. Nevertheless, we anticipate being at 79 sworn effective by the beginning of the next tour on January 3rd. And when we get to approximately 76 sworn and approximately 36 officers available for patrol, we will no longer be able to deploy overnight coverage. And that's something that I think we need to know as a community, that there will be no proactive midnight patrol. Here's a visualization of our staffing structure. And it shows the fact that we have what we call 2 sides, the left side and the right side. Our officers work 4 days a week, 10-hour shifts. And because of that, we have one team that works some days and one team that works the other days. And 1 day a week, they both overlap. This is important because it shows that when we talk about 80 plus officers or 90 plus officers, as we had prior to the budget discussions in June, we're not talking about 90 officers who are immediately available for any given event or who are on patrol in our streets. At any given time, we have about 8 officers on patrol for our 44,000 residents and the additional 16,000 students and the thousands of people who come in for work and the thousands more who come in normal times for entertainment and our restaurants and our vibrant nightlife. And while those things have certainly been curtailed over this past year, and we are seeing a very different posture with regard to overall activity in the city, those things will return. This epidemic, pandemic will end someday. We know that it will. We're anticipating that day eagerly, but it will come with increased levels of calls for service. Another thing to consider as we look at these numbers is that everything is affected by something called the availability factor. The availability factor is calculated based on officers' contractual leave, and And it means that I don't have 100% of my officers at any given time. I have 86.3% of my officers at any given time. And that only accounts for contractual leave. It doesn't account for injury leave. It doesn't account for leave owing to training necessities. It doesn't count for somebody taking time off that they've earned and accrued, but isn't part of their contract, but they still say, I'm not going to go in today. I feel a little bit like I need a day off. It doesn't account for the big snow dump days that hopefully we'll have more of this year than we did last year. Nevertheless, when we look at our numbers, we're not talking about the absolute number. We're talking about 86.3% of that absolute number owing to the availability factor. Here is a picture and another way of graphically representing what our staffing was prior to the budget process. This is our average, 96 sworn, 83 really with the availability factor, and 50 officers available for patrol, about 43 with availability factor. But we cover availability factor with overtime, with changes in staffing. When we have a swing shift, as this graphic depicts, we're able to take that swing shift sometimes and rob Peter to pay Paul with regard to making certain that our other shifts are handled. That includes, for example, the evenings and the day shifts, which have really the greatest number of calls for service and are the most important to have staffed. This visual is robust staffing. It's a full swing shift. It is a street crime team. It has a full complement of officers and detectives. It has our specialized roles, our emergency response officer, our community affairs officer, our domestic violence prevention officer, and our school resource officers. And those roles, as I said before, really add to the core responsibility of patrol and make certain that we have a fully functioning department that meets the standards that this community has come to expect with regard to community policing. Here's where our current staffing is, and that's 81 sworn effective. And with this is the last point at which we can have some specialized roles. We have adequate staffing at our detectives, and Cousy Detectives is a little understaffed. We are still staffing our airport. One of the officers depicted here has a red eye over that officer. That is because that officer has an injury, not a long-term sick. We have one officer who is long-term sick and will never return to duty and is essentially on a workers' comp situation. But this officer has a long-term injury, awaiting surgery, but not effective for deployment at the current moment. This is what we anticipate our staffing looking like by January 3rd. We move to approximately 79 sworn, and this includes still that one officer injured, but also 2 additional officers who are highly expected to move on to other opportunities prior to the beginning of the next tour on January 3rd, or at the very best, very, very shortly into that tour. And that brings us down to 79 sworn effective, 68 with the availability factor, and 38 officers for patrol. This is a point at which we have to reassign our community affairs officer back to patrol, and will no longer have the role that that officer performs, incredibly important role with regard to making connections with community, with regard to handling graffiti complaints, with regard to overseeing graffiti response from the city and along with city agencies who are partners. And also it entails the redeployment of our emergency response officer to the road as well. Here are possible departures that we anticipate. We have other officers too who are expected to go on long-term military deployments, 3 who we know are exploring other possibilities with other agencies, but are not yet as far down the road as the 2 that I'm counting as quite probable, quite definite for the next tour. And 1 who is going to be on relatively long-term family leave. Again, this doesn't even account for the other military officers who we anticipate being taken by the Guard during vaccine deployment. At this point, when we get to a level of this, we would end overnight coverage. There is simply there are not enough officers in this scenario to have a safe overnight coverage, and we would end proactive overnight coverage. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later. Then we get into the question of officers who are retirement eligible, because previously we've been talking about officers who are leaving owing to a desire for other possibilities and owing to a desire to be in agencies other than this one. Some of them are career-oriented federal agencies. Some of them, as I said, in their exit paperwork have explicitly stated that it's about this agency and moving on to other opportunities in neighboring agencies or in other states. But we are also facing a number of officers who are eligible for retirement by September 2021. 7 will be eligible by February, and that includes both of our current deputy chiefs. 12 total will be 5 more, in other words, 5 additionals past those 7s, but 12 total officers will be eligible for retirement by September 2021. And if we take all of those potential retirements and we take the departures that we currently know about, and not the ones that may be happening in other parts of officers' minds or expectations and things that they're looking at, we end up with a department that is cut by half. A department that is at 59 sworn effective, 51 with the availability factor, and 28 officers available for patrol. There is no swing shift. There is no midnight coverage. There is no street crime team. Detectives is staffed lower than optimal. And we have a sense of we are unable to field our community affairs officers. We're unable to put up our domestic violence officer, our emergency response officer, and are facing those issues. So here quickly is, again, this is optimal, robust staffing, the average staffing that we experienced prior to the budget amendments. And this is where we anticipate being by September. The most imminent change, once we move from 42 available for patrol to 36 available for patrol, is the end of a proactive midnight shift. And that's depicted here. So again, the point of this is for people to really see that when we talk about our staffing numbers, because we are staffing 24 hours a day, because we have to move through all 7 days, because we have detectives and airport and other and supervisory roles, when we talk about staffing, this is what we're talking about with regard to the people who are on the road, who are answering the calls for service that come from our neighbors. And we see here these two sides. Ultimately, if we get to 36 officers for patrol, or when headcount is in the mid-70s, we will no longer be able to deploy an overnight shift. Ending overnight coverage has implications. The Vermont State Police currently does not have a 24-hour coverage. And if our staffing falls below 36 officers available for patrol, we'll have to follow suit. In order to maximize coverage during the hours when call volume is highest, that means that we would end in-person response during the hours when call volume is lowest, from 3 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. And we would only accept online reports or reports by phone. The midnight shift is not something that we are thinking about ending lightly. This is a serious move. It is predicated on the idea that if we only have enough staffing for 1 or 2 officers, they cannot conduct safe, proactive patrol on their own. And they become only a responsive entity. They would be based in the building for facility security. We have weapons in this facility, and we have contraband, narcotics, etc. Evidence that is necessary for trial. We have to have staff in this building 24 hours a day. We cannot, however, have officers proactively patrolling the streets when there's only 1 or 2 for the entire city. Instead, we would have a night watch, and not a night watch on a big icy wall, but a night watch here at 1 North Avenue. There would be a protocol that we are still in the process of contemplating and developing for response to a small number of serious crimes. Possible examples of those serious crimes are homicide or aggravated assault with medical transport, or robbery with medical transport. In other words, instances in which people's physical safety is at immediate risk or has already been impinged, and officers have to respond in order to set up the necessary scene for other officers to be deployed at a later point during the daylight hours in order to collect evidence, in order to secure a scene for processing. But the idea of proactive response, roving response, response to things like property alarms or public order calls or suspicious events, that would not be possible with the staffing that we are anticipating. And as I said, with regard to that first slide, talking about the length of time that it takes to hire, there is no short-term fix for this. Hiring new officers takes in excess of 14 months. And at best, if recruitment were to begin today, we would possibly be able to recruit officers into the August academy class. And if they all made it through, we would have solo officers on the road in March of 2022. But I do anticipate further losses beyond those that are envisioned here prior to March of 2022. So that takes us to where we go. And there has to be a place to look up to. There has to be a way forward for all of us. And there are ways forward. The Racial Justice through Economic and Criminal Justice Resolution envisioned assessments. Those assessments include a full operational and functional assessment of the police department and an understanding of what it does and its call volume and its response. The joint committee that came from the resolution also envisioned a process whereby a facilitation and listening tour of citizens in the community allows for an understanding of what our community's expectations are for public safety and how that public safety might move forward and what a vision of a future is. That is, both of those processes are going to affect how we think about moving forward and how we're able to move forward. Neither of those processes has begun. And so we are in a position right now of trying to determine what we can do in the short term, such as it is, in order to address these issues. And time is a thief. Time is a thief. And because those immeasurably helpful processes have not yet begun, we need to assess and address the fact that officers are leaving and that calls for service are still coming in. We do have a 2-year plan. Where do we go from here? There are examples of calls for service that could be divertible. We prefer to have the assessments give us better data on these, but we do know that there are certain things for which we can conceivably use non-sworn, unarmed civilian staff in order to address problems in ways that do not involve sending armed officers to every single call for service. And some of those calls include issues with homelessness. Some of those include quality of life, certain kinds of quality of life calls, juvenile disturbances, etc. The goal of this is to make certain that the sworn resources that are left to us are used better and that we're freeing up officers to focus on community engagement and preventing and responding to violent crime, their real bailiwick, while we use other kinds of resources to address these other kinds of calls. So what are those resources? Those potential resources are non-sworn resources that we currently have and can potentially build out. Our community service officer is one of those. It's an existing position. It performs a variety of field work in support of basic police operations, animal control, subpoena service, material transport, traffic control. And there are other things that we could expand that role to address as well. Noise complaints, certain kinds of quality of life complaints, certain kinds of public order issues. We can also turn it into a resource that is more readily available for a police officer response to assess whether or not something really is a crime that needs police officer response, and then be able to transfer over to CSOs. We currently only have 2 CSOs, one on each of our 2 day shift teams, but there is the potential for more. We've also talked before, and the mayor has talked at length about this, about the community service liaison position. We have a person in a position similar to this, a tremendous asset to this police department, a social worker who is an absolute treasure with regard to working with our houseless population here in Burlington, and has been constantly working with those individuals now that they are mostly housed in various locations owing to the COVID pandemic throughout the county, and is still making those connections, taking on those roles. Also someone who's able to work with substance use disorder, people who are suffering from substance use disorder, making certain that we are handling folks who have certain kinds of mental health crises that don't really evolve into full-blown crises that require police response, but are nevertheless disproportionate users of our services here in the city. Hiring CSOs and CSLs is a shorter term fix than hiring police officers, but it's not something that can be done immediately. The time for a CSO to be a solo on the road is about 7.5 months. And CSLs are a little bit more immediately deployable, but the hiring process there is long. When the last time we hired CSOs, we had 10 applicants and 2 made it through our screening process and only 1 was hired. CSLs we envision being a little bit more, in some ways difficult to hire, but also perhaps possibly a quicker process simply because we would be going for people who have specific kinds of skill sets and working with some entities who are capable of giving us an understanding of who best applicants are. There is a way forward. There is a way forward that requires more than 2 years to implement fully, but that may provide the city with something like the full services that are achieved by 96 plus sworn officers, while staffing nevertheless fewer than 80 sworn. And it depends on the results of those 2 assessments that we are really eager to have started. It depends on the ability to hire CSOs and CSLs to identify people who are appropriate for those roles and get them in. And it depends on the viability of offloading police services to those other positions. But it is a way forward, and it's a way forward that achieves something that clearly parts of our community are calling for: fewer armed police officers. What we really are hopeful for is an understanding of the degree to which the entirety of our community wants this, and the entire community's ideas for how we move forward and where we go. And hopefully that facilitation process will begin to help us understand that. There is a place where this agency is able to recover, not in any kind of short term, but over 4, 5, 6 years, a place where we are able to cut new ground and be an innovator on a national scale that actually attracts officers and non-sworn positions to this agency to be part of something new and part of something big and part of something better. But it is a long way off. And before that happens, the people in our city need to understand that there are going to be hard times owing to where we are staffing wise. And the loss of the midnights, the very probable loss of midnight coverage, is the first of those. That is the end of the presentation that I have. And so I will open up to questions now. Again, we will be posting that immediately after this is over and making certain that people are able to access it. I'm looking through a few comments right now and noting our TSA rules, by the way, do require us to have officers. We have to have 2 officers because there are 2 gates and they need to be on at all times. And that's the nature of the staffing there. The 8 that we have staffed at the airport is the absolute minimum that we can have staffed there. And frankly, if it were its own police department, it could not be staffed at 8 because of an availability factor. It would have to be staffed probably at something closer to 12. We routinely have to send officers from the road to the airport when airport officers take time off or are sick. So I will open it up, I guess, to questions now and ask Shannon to promote the deputy chiefs and Director Dodson too, if he's available for visual, to co-panelists so that we can field some questions.
Perfect. Members of the press and the public, if you would just raise your hand if you have a question. You certainly can use the question and the question section located within Zoom to pose your questions. If you would identify yourself with your first and last name and the organization that you're with, I'd appreciate it. Grace Etson.
Hi, this is Grace Ellison from DT Digger. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Grace.
I just wanted to clarify to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. Is it your preference to hire more CSOs or CSLs, or is this just an option that you're putting forward?
So I believe that it is a path forward that is shorter term than waiting for officers, which frankly is a much longer term. It is a path forward. It's a path forward that does address issues. Police know that there are jobs that call police to a scene that are not police jobs. We know it. We go to many every single day. And we're happy to have other opportunities and other resources to address those. This is an opportunity for us to explore how we can start to learn to divert resources and divert calls for service to non-sworn resources. And that will allow for certain kinds of savings. It may address certain kinds of calls in the community for a desire not to have sworn officers at every kind of call. It is something that I'm eager to explore. and it is something that we look into. However, some of it has to do with issues with regard to budget. So in having the decline in our headcount, that budget then was diverted to other resources, and it's not sitting available for additional staff. We are going to have to create new staff to address our calls, whether those are sworn officers, whether those are contracts with other outside entities who provide 501c3 type, NGO type services for mental health, et cetera, whether it's the creation of resources to handle all traffic or all kinds of neighbor disputes, et cetera. Those all will ultimately require funding and budget. And currently, the budget that was saved through our headcount attrition is accounted for. So some of that's going to have to come from other places. I am hopeful that we can find some additional budget for CSOs and for CSLs in order to envision that last slide, that proposal. I think that is the best option we have of moving forward for public safety in the shortest term that delivers the kinds of services that our community expects and fulfills our obligation to keep people safe.
So is this something that you're going to be pitching to the city council to authorize? Do you need their authorization to move forward on this?
So those are discussions that I'm in with the mayor and with City Hall. Obviously, he's been dialed into this. We shared this with the city council, hoped to present it earlier, but are hopeful now to have a working session sometime in this month in order to discuss some of these things.
And I was curious as well as if you could talk a little bit more from your perspective of the consequence if the midnight shift goes away. What is your greatest concern if officers are not able to patrol on that shift?
My greatest concern is that although that graphic that we showed with regard to call volume shows a very distinct decrease in call volume in those hours, if we were to sort it only for type 3 calls for service, the calls for service that involve active crimes, especially crimes that impinge on people's safety, it doesn't quite trend down as much. That very, very distinct diminishment is not as apparent. And I have great concerns about our obligation to keep people safe. I also have concerns about the ability of officers to keep people safe when they themselves have to be safe to do so. And so the balance of that and the ability to make certain that we are somehow addressing the most of our calls and the most of our citizens and the most of the situations that officers are needed for requires that, is this kind of decision. It's not one that we take lightly. It's not one with which I'm entirely comfortable, but it is where we are because of the staffing issue.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I was a bit confused by that when you say that the calls for service for active crimes, they're not going down within that time period?
No, they do. Everything goes down. Everything goes down in the wee hours, and we definitely see deep decreases in all types of call during that period of time. And there are some midnight shifts where almost nothing happens from 3 a.m. to 7:30. But there are some shifts where things do happen. We recently had a shooting, an attempted homicide that happened just before this time period would have kicked in. But so would have had the benefit of the evening shift still being on. They serve until 2:45. But those things can also happen at 4 in the morning.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, when I was looking at that chart of the CSOs and the CSL, the staffing chart, does that proposal have 6 CSOs and 3 CSLs on your staff? That's correct.
I'll clarify that sheet is only showing one team, it's only showing one side. Rather than showing all the previous graphics had shown both sides for the sake of a full picture of how many officers are available at any given time. This one shows just what a typical day looks like. So it's only one side, could be the left side, could be the right side, but that's what it's depicting.
So
a supervisor, I'm sorry, Grace?
Would you be proposing the hiring of 12 CSOs and 6 CSLs? Is that what that looks like?
That is 12 CSOs and 6 CSLs, that's correct.
Gotcha. Do you have a rounded out budget of what that would look like salary wise to hire all those people?
No, we don't have a complete budget picture on that yet, but it would be slightly less than our budget that was initially proposed for this year, because both CSOs and CSLs cost a little bit less. And I'll defer to Deputy Chief LeBrecq.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's clear that this is something that we have started to put together as a solution, because we have not been given any path forward where we're starting from here, with losing all these officers, where we're supposed to go to. So here over at BPD, we've actually come up with this. This was kind of what we put together, envisioning how we could change policing. And so stuff like budgeting, and even if you have that many CSOs, right now we have one CSO vehicle and it's split between the two CSOs. Obviously, you're going to have at least 2 more vehicles. Otherwise, you'd have 3 people working out of one vehicle, and that would negate the whole ability of them to function independently and without, having to wait to go call for the other 2 people to finish whatever they're on. So this is something that we are still actively working on, and it's going to take some time to figure it all out. But that's certainly, our vision, or hopefully something that we can do now that we've gotten into this staffing issue.
And I am curious to hear what Director Dodson thinks about this plan and the position that the police department is in right now with its staffing levels. Director Dodson, what's your take on the pitch that the department is presenting and the current staffing levels that it's struggling with?
Yes, good morning. Thanks for the question. The first thing for me is to establish that notwithstanding the, I actually think, collective agreement that there is a need and room for growth and improvement in the BPD, I believe that Deputy or Interim Chief rather Murad and his deputies agree with that. And I think there's also something to the fact that if you look at policing nationally, look at the kind of changes that have been proposed and implemented, BPD is somewhere down the line in those changes. There are things that have already happened prior to this time, more thoughtful, enlightened, informed policing practices. None of this eliminates the idea that there are additional things to look at, places for growth. The chief and his deputies are involved in looking at traffic stop data and use of force data, and all of these things are ongoing. So those things are important and happening. Notwithstanding that, per your question about the presentation, these are the facts. BPD has and will continue to provide public safety services to the community, to the entire community. And that community has the right to understand how the changes that were put in place as a result of the resolution over the summer will impact our historic approach to policing. We're in a period of lots of suggestions about changing that. My understanding, those are suggestions. There's no blueprint. There's no framework. That's what Deputy Chief LeBrecq was pointing out. There was a mandate to change, but my understanding was that a significant part of what those changes might be would be based on the assessment, which has not happened yet. Actually is not scheduled to happen yet. So it would be putting the cart before the horse. Certainly the chief, the interim chief, Murad and his colleagues could have, from June, started reshaping the police force and putting in new things and expecting a police force that carried 74 sworn officers, but that would have been unilateral and not in line with what the community wants, because they would have been doing it based on some idea they had about what it would look like going forward, and not at all informed by the community or the assessment. So they didn't do that. They effectively just stayed the status quo and continued to operate as historically. And now this is where things are. Certainly the chief and his deputies can't control resignations, can't control retirements, can't control officers seeking work at other agencies. So this is where we are. And I believe that it was incumbent upon leadership to share this with the community now and have an understanding that we're here, and continuing the attrition will most likely continue. And the hiring situation, as someone who has spent some time inside, from a standpoint of a requirement, also we want that. I think we want the kind of rigor that the hiring process requires. And it is a long process. Just for me to be in that building, I had to go through quite a good deal of scrutiny, if you will, And that's about safety and records and data and connection to FBI national databases. There's a lot in the mix. So that's my sense of where we are.
And so do you support the hiring of these CSOs and CSLs in place of sworn armed officers? Do you think that's the best direction for the department to go in?
I'm not sure it would be accurate to say the best direction. I think it's one direction. I think we've seen some examples nationally where this sort of redeployment can work well. But once again, I've been raised, and in my profession, various professional roles that I've had, I trust expertise and experience and data and assessment. So I really believe that bringing in some external expertise, we're not the first people. Many communities other than Burlington have looked at this work, and there are people out there who are effectively the architects and engineers of what you might do in this case. And I think it's really makes sense for us to consult with those people and to finish the community assessment, which is underway. We have contracted with the vendor, and they are beginning to speak to the community so that moving forward, what we do is community informed. It does appear that the community is interested in CSOs and CSLs, and we're interested in CSOs and CSLs. So as part of the reorganization, I believe that pursuing CSOs, CSLs, what's appropriate for them to respond to, what's safe for them to respond to, et cetera, is an important and fruitful path to pursue.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Liz Murray, if you'd identify yourself.
Hi, Liz Murray from the Burlington Free Press. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Hi,
ma'am.
Liz.
Hi, everyone. Acting Chief Murad, you mentioned that 5 out of 8 people who recently left mentioned the City Council resolution in their letters of resignation. I wondered if you could be more specific about what exactly they said about that resolution when they were leaving, what caused them to leave, and also if there were other reasons that they cited for leaving, if you could talk about some of those.
I'd have to find those and see the language. I do know that I had discussions. The most recent person to resign has not gave me that verbally, not on her exit paperwork isn't yet completed. She presented a letter of resignation, but the exit paperwork isn't yet completed, but stated in our interview that it was a sense of, she had concerns about support. She had concerns about after action consideration of in the moment decisions that officers make and the way in which those will be judged. She also, however, mentioned that, it's not just Burlington, that she knows that the profession in general is changing and that Montpelier is in the process of enacting some similar kinds of new ways of evaluating officer conduct and behavior. And she is actually not going to another law enforcement job. 4 of the 5 who mentioned the council are going to other law enforcement jobs, either in this county or out of state or at the state level. She's actually moving to another profession in all likelihood. But the specific language, I could try to find it for you and get it to you at another point if you want to talk offline, Liz.
Yeah, that would be great. And what were some of the other reasons that people were leaving, beyond the City Council resolution?
Well, so of the 8 sworn, 5 were persons who filed exit paperwork that stated it was the City Council, and 4 of those have gone on to other public safety jobs. 1 officer filed a tenure-related departure, i.e. a 20-year retirement. 1 officer resigned while under suspension, and 1 sergeant was bought out of his contract by the city.
Okay, thank you.
Chief, if we can, I just want to go back to Councilor Pine's proposed a couple of questions, and I do know that you addressed some TSA things, but I think speaking to with regard to officers at the airport, specifically, is it possible that TSA would accept sworn officers at BTV from South Burlington and/or Chittenden County Sheriffs? This would deploy the 8 officers back to patrol duty.
I don't believe that the TSA makes a distinction about who is the police officer at those gates.
Mike Donahue, if you would identify yourself.
Mike Donahue, Vermont News First. Chiefs, good morning, and Kyle, good to see you. I just wanted to go back over some numbers. I think I saw 2 officers would be kept on overnight, but it also said they could end up possibly having to dispatch. Is that, did I see that?
No, not that they would.
That they might have to, if you cut back on dispatching also, or they might, if somebody calls in sick, that suddenly one of those officers has to go do dispatching.
So again, these are, we're still in the process of thinking through how this kind of structure would work. And it's new territory for us. But our dispatch center would continue to operate because it also has a fire component. And fire is not contemplating any of these kinds of changes, of course. But the police dispatcher would not really have a purpose in the fact that it can't be dispatching things. So instead, it would be possible that calls that go through the PSAP, that's a public safety answering point, that's what you get when you call 911. You don't get directly to our dispatch center. You get to a PSAP. The closest is in Williston at the Vermont State Police. They then take the call, they take initial information, they divert it to the dispatch center here, and the dispatch center here then diverts it to officers in the road for appropriate response. That middle step would not be necessary in this configuration, potentially. And we would potentially be able to have the officers who are here in the facility for primarily facility security be able to field those calls themselves instead. And they would take those calls and inform callers that for the vast majority of kinds of calls, there would be no in-person response, but officers would be able to respond upon the initiation of the day shift. But they would also be there in case something of enough severity occurred in order to say, okay, we'll take that call, and then they would dispatch themselves to that call appropriately. And we'd have to talk through that. We'd have to talk through what the responsibilities are with regard to response for public safety and response for officer safety in order to determine how we're deploying to something. The fact is that a lot of the systems that we've pioneered with regard to these kinds of responses require really robust resources. Burlington was ahead of the curve on addressing issues with, for example, people in mental health distress or people who are barricaded. We pioneered with the Police Executive Research Forum a program called ICAT. And ICAT now is being deployed in cities across the nation. It's been shown through academic studies to be really effective with regard to keeping subjects and officers much safer. But it is resource intensive. You have to have a lot of officers. If you're going to control a barricaded situation in a way that is not simply kicking in the door and going in, but is instead about long-term negotiation and about working with other partners and about keeping that scene safe but secure, you have to have sufficient officers to be able to control points of ingress and egress. You have to have sufficient number of officers to be able to be in a stack in case you have to go in. You have to have sufficient number of officers to be able to conduct negotiations or secure those negotiations if they're being conducted by someone else. You have to be able to have scene security to make certain that you don't have neighbors or family members or the press, no offense, coming in and trying to get through that scene. But you do have to have a number of resources to conduct that kind of secure operation. And we're thankful that those kinds of scenes don't happen often, but when they do, we need those resources at hand. And 2 officers, maybe even 3 officers on a midnight shift is not sufficient for that. So when we had our homicide in April, we had a full complement of officers who were able to get to that scene and secure it properly, not knowing what was happening at that scene. There had just been an active full-on gunfight between 3 people with multiple rounds sprayed up and down North Avenue, and ultimately a person dead. And that response required a number of officers in order to be able to secure it. And that's even before then you secure the scene and begin the long investigation process, and our detectives come in and are able to solve what was frankly a stone cold whodunit. There were no living witnesses of that. There was no knowledge of who it had been, and they had to piece that together through evidence at the scene, through interviews, et cetera. Those are all resource intensive processes.
One of the things, and I did see at the time, and the term was, we're going to lose the overnight shift was said earlier, I like to think I sort of know what's going on in police jargon and everything like that, but I don't think the general public understood it. And I certainly didn't understand that you were eliminating the midnight shift. Essentially, you were shutting down the police department from 3 to 7 or whatever. And I'm not sure that saying we're closing down the overnight shift, I got the impression that that was the shift that was working whatever from 9 to 3 or 8 to 4 or something, but you'd still have a midnight shift. So that's why I think a lot of people are flabbergasted now to hear you're going to essentially be part-time police department like the state police and not have calls. The other thing I wanted to ask about is, so if you get a call, much like the stabbing over on Riverside Avenue at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning at some site in Burlington, you're going to only have 2 officers on duty. Presumably, you want additional backup for something like that. How long do you think South Burlington and Winooski and Colchester and Heinsberg police are going to be satisfied responding to complaints in Burlington, providing backup for your officers? I know you back up other departments, but after a while it gets a little old if they're going over there 3 or 4 times.
So we do back up other officers. We have mutual aid agreements with all of our surrounding agencies and entities, and we routinely do it. Talking about overnight, midnight coverage, heavy incident response, just about a year ago plus, Deputy Chief LeBrecq was the leader of a team that went to the Sheraton. Well, it's not the Sheraton anymore, the Doubletree, I think, which is technically in South Burlington, for an individual who was barricaded, was armed, was making threats, and showed real signs of potentially becoming an active shooter kind of situation, and went there with our ERV, with our team, and deployed ITAC tactics that were able to augment what South Burlington was providing, and essentially took the lead on that scene in a way that was ultimately safe for everyone involved. And that is the kind of thing we'll no longer be able to do. Mutual aid, the key part of that phrase is the first part. It's mutual. And I do believe that our partner agencies in other towns are not going to be keen on providing aid if it's not mutual. And so that's something that we're going to have to see. I presented this information to the Chittenden County law enforcement executives yesterday, and I think that there was some surprise among our partner agencies.
And would you consider eliminating the airport division? I mean, obviously let it go back to its own police department. I mean, when police first were assigned out there, I can remember the sheriff's department did it for a while. South Burlington was contemplating doing it. They finally went with their own police department and just let the city create their own police department, or let the sheriff's department take it over, and that's one less headache for you.
So that's both contractual, and it would be a decision that would be made at a higher level than mine. I believe that the Burlington International Airport needs Burlington police officers. I believe that to be a part of our responsibility. I'm sorry?
What contract are you talking
The
about?
BPOA
Is that with
contract.
the union or with the pardon me?
Certainly the BPOA contract. There may be other contracts involved as well, but certainly the BPOA contract.
But if you have a reduction in service, I assume the union contract has to adjust to that.
There are ways for the contract to adjust. There are also plans such as the ones that we're demonstrating here. However, the adjustments they have to account for continued presence at that airport. We cannot abandon our role at that airport.
And maybe the last question, but so when you have an emergency situation at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're going to have call outs, presumably, for officers to come in and, for the stabbing and everything like that. That's going to be a delayed response and everything like that. How many of your officers actually live within, say, the city of Burlington, or within a 4 or 5 mile drive versus, I mean, I don't know what the current living arrangements are, but I know you used to have officers that lived in New York State, and I assume under the union contract, there's a pecking order as to when people get called back in for overtime and extra duty. So when there's a stabbing, are we going to be waiting for officers to respond from New York State or from Madison County, Franklin County?
So the Detective Bureau functions differently than USB with regard to this.
I'm
USB doesn't.
talking about officers who are going to be uniformed to
I
back up
understand.
those two.
I understand, but so for those kinds of calls, calling in additional officers, for the time being, we have a model for our detectives that when we have something like that homicide on North Avenue, or even the most recent attempted homicide on Pine Street, we call officers in from the Detective Bureau and they have a call schedule. They have cars available to them because they have this kind of responsibility, and they are able to make it in, and their living situations are up to them to make determinations about how they get in or not. The number of officers, to answer the previous question, the number of officers who live in the city, it's small. The number of officers who live, I wouldn't begin to be able to tell you whether or not, how many are close within 4 miles or not. They're either inside the city or not. It's a small number. I can get that figure for you, but I don't have it off the top of my head, but it is small. The idea of calling officers in, we have a model with regard to canine officers. We do not have a model with regard to other road officers. And it's one that we would have to develop as we start to think about this. And I'm going to ask to pass this over to Deputy Chief Lebrecq so that he can fill it in better and can also address a previous question that was raised about population issues from Councilmember Pine on our questions.
Sure, just to address, calling officers in, even some officers who live close by, you're still talking, if they were within, say, somewhere in Chittenden County and 15 to 20 minutes getting here. Once they get here, they still have to come in, they have to change. Then they have to get a cruiser and head out. So, whatever the incident that's occurred at that time will most likely be over. And the officers that are on the night watch here that are on scene are just preserving the scene, trying to make it as safe as possible, trying to preserve evidence. So that's going to take a certain amount of time, even if we call in officers. And quite honestly, we would just start calling down through the shift. I think, at that point, if it was something that big, we would just start calling officers to see who was available and be able to answer. The canine officers are different, having been one myself. They have a take-home car for their dogs, specifically made for their dogs. That's why they have it. They have their uniforms at home. They have everything at home, so they can respond much quicker. At least that's the travel time for them. Once they arrive in the city, they're ready to go. So the thing, to remember is that the night watch folks, by the time they get there, most likely whatever has happened will be over. And they are just going to try to make that scene safe. And obviously that would be one of the situations where we would look towards mutual aid, the other agencies to come help us make the scene safe and help us preserve evidence and stuff like that. Most likely a lot of the detectives and the officers that are responding in are probably all going to make it here at the same time. So addressing that question. The other question that Councilor Pine had, he referenced census data of 44,000 citizens living in the city, and that did include the colleges and stuff. That was the 2010 census, I believe. So obviously, if you look around Burlington, there's been numerous more residence apartment buildings built, the ones on North Ave, the ones over on Chase Street. We've obviously, and it'll be interesting to see what the new census shows us. But I'd like to call attention to that Burlington is the largest city in the state and also is one of the larger hubs that offers services daily to a number of people. So we have people, especially during the daytime hours between, the early morning 8, when people are coming into work, just the number of people that work here in Burlington that don't live in Burlington is one thing to take into account. The services, the hospital, mental health services, state services, the courthouse, the federal courthouse. I can sit here and name, a bunch of those, but obviously, people are coming into Burlington to use those, the retail offerings here in Burlington, the Church Street Marketplace, the waterfront, depending on what time of year is. So I will conservatively say to you that I could almost guarantee you there's at least 80,000 people that come in and out of this city daily. And that's a lot. That's a lot to police. There's a lot of things going on at that time. And also addressing his reduction in car stops that we do. So obviously this year is an anomaly for the number of calls. Although we are at roughly, I believe, 22,000. We're at 22,715 calls for service right now. Last year we had 28,476 calls for service. Of those, only 1,975 were actual car stops. So even if you take those off, you're still looking upwards of 26,000 calls for service that involved police officers. And our officers here, they will go to the call. Like our detective unit normally doesn't respond to a call, but it may become something a detective does. But most of the time, the officer takes the initial report, has to write up that report. And if they have time, our officers here actually do a lot of their own investigations and work on those. And then if it's really involved or involves like, people outside of the city that would have to be interviewed, then we hand that stuff off to our fraud cases, stuff like that, we would hand off to our detective division. Now, they're also going to be affected by not having enough officers as well. So you're actually talking about a reduction in officers, but also reduction in the number of detectives to be able to investigate those cases that officers, it's too much work and it takes them off the road for too long a time. So that's something all to take into consideration, that there is a lot of people that come and visit us. And if you think of, other times like when the marathon is here, 4th of July, the 3rd of July fireworks, the Santa run, everything that's been put on hold because of COVID. And I'm hoping that, we're heading out of that right now. But when that comes roaring back and people are going to be ready to come back to Burlington, ready to come back to the marketplace, ready to come back to our waterfront. There's a new marina down there that just added 300 slips. Our bike path has been renewed. People are going to be coming to the city in droves, and they should be. It's a beautiful place. I grew up here. It's going to require, things are going to happen. People are going to have fender benders. It's going to require police services or a new form of police services that, we need to be prepared for.
Courtney Lambden.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I know we're running about an hour now, so I'll just try to keep this short. Acting Chief Murad, you mentioned that you're in discussions with the mayor about this issue, about staffing levels, and you've discussed with him this proposal to hire alternative responders, the CSLs, CSOs. I'm wondering if you're also considering asking the city council or the mayor to ask the city council to reconsider their staffing resolution.
We would certainly like that. I think that, as I pointed out, we still have even if that decision were reconsidered today or changed today, we have a long window in front of us for obtaining police officers. Do I think that we need more police officers? Yes. I think that I believe that we are a 96-person agency. I believe that graphic that I showed of a robust agency is the best way to serve the public and make be able to do community policing, be able to keep people safe. But I also am looking forward to what we hear from the community with regard to possibility. And the alternative proposal that ended that presentation is an example of a solution that is achievable in a shorter time period that seems to meet some of the ideas that are being proposed by our community, by others around the country, and yet still is able to address our obligations. Would I want the opportunity? But let me point out that proposal does in fact have a head count of officers that is about just below 80. So we're already in a position of falling far below that, and falling below that by September. And because of the way that the Vermont Police Academy is structured, because of the timing that I showed with regard to how long it takes to train officers, all of these decisions we make are going to have very long timeframes for execution or for amelioration of where we currently are with regard to staffing. I would like the permission to start hiring officers again and identifying officers. I would like the ability to explore how we're going to incentivize getting officers to this police department. I would like to explore the ability to have some lateral officers come in. Again, that is not a solution because there are a few of them, but one or two of them would make a difference. And I would also like an opportunity to have the officers here understand that there's a level of support that doesn't cause them to move on, so that we could perhaps stymie and stanch some of our bleeding. But ultimately, I think that a path forward may also accomplish that. I think that we have the ability to envision a future where, again, we become an agency that attracts people from all over because we are doing something new, something cutting edge, something that is a future for this profession that is in a real crisis point nationally. There's a lot that is changing in our profession nationally right now. I mean, police officers believe in possibility. It is why they run towards danger while others run away. They believe in the possibility of creating order. They believe in the possibility of keeping a city free from fear and free from crime. And they took an oath to that possibility. Our officers here still believe in that possibility. That is why they are out, why right now, mission-wise, our officers are incredibly focused on what they're doing. There are real concerns about the oversight of that, about how they feel with regard to support. They know that aspects of the community support them. They feel it, they see it, they hear it in the streets, but they also see something different when it comes to certainly, you know, the moments this summer with regard to protests, with regard to the encampment. And that is, that causes a lot of you know, conflicting kinds of feelings and motivations. But with regard to focus on the public safety mission, they are focused on it. And I want the methods, I want whatever tools I can find and put at my disposal in order to make certain that they continue to do that and that we can continue to support them as they do the good work. To make certain that we have accountability properly as well, but to support the good work that's done, because this agency has been doing good work for a very long time. It pioneered community policing in the late 90s. It pioneered working with mental health providers through the street outreach program 2 decades ago. Years before other cities are now thinking of it and talking about it as if it's a new way forward. And we've been doing it for quite some time with the Howard Center and street outreach. It pioneered body cameras before any other entities in the state, I believe, but certainly the first large agency in the state. We pioneered the ICAT process that I mentioned before. And we are doing a lot with regard to our the Special Committee to Review Policing Practices, Community Policing Practices, with regard to the Police Commission and its representation and the way in which it does have a body that reflects our community, including parts of our community that are underrepresented, with our duty to intervene policy that we promulgated immediately after the George Floyd's killing at police hands, our use of force policy, which is a model for the state, I believe the best in the state and one of the best in the country, and I looked at a lot of them. I have met with and talked with, as did Chief Morrison, leaders of the protests, marched with members of the Black Perspective. We have an elaborate police commission role in employee discipline and civilian complaints that is very specific and very detailed and talks about ways in which the police commission has input into those processes, is entitled to all the information from those processes, and can also make recommendations that, if disagreed with, it has an outlet for making those disagreements known to the public. Ironically, that document, which is incredibly a great strengthening of the police commission, created because of recommendations from the special committee to review policing policies that met for more than a year and included members from all across our community. That document was signed the very night that the encampment began. And frankly, there are changes that have happened in this department and things that this department has done that are moving in the very directions that people want. And then we sort of lurch at times. We lurch forward, and then there's a lot of passion about getting something done without recognizing the things that are being done and the things that have been done, and the path that we're already on to get more things done. And Director Dodson's position is that. The Director of Police Transformation is an example too of all these things. We're using new use of force training that prioritizes grappling and control holds and really moves away from strikes to make things much safer for subjects and for officers. We're talking about anti-racism training and have just begun contracting with a provider who's worked with companies and with the military and is going to be doing a long, ongoing, iterative process of anti-racism and bias training with our department. We procured a new system to be able to track both use of force incidents and discipline and performance monitoring and measurements, the benchmark system that is going to facilitate all of this and can be used to give that information to the police commission and to make it more transparent for the public, because public transparency is something that I think is incredibly important. We have had our own documents with regard to traffic stops, with regard to use of force, with regard to arrest rates, which was produced in conjunction with the Innovation and Technology Department of the city. But we've put those forward proactively and for the public. I want more of those things. I think our department wants more. I know that our community wants more. We could create work with the police commission to have a disciplinary matrix that binds the recommendations made by the police commission and the ultimate choices and decisions made by the chief. We can talk about releasing more body camera footage. We can talk about letting neighbors into this agency in a way that allows them to understand some of the things that this presentation shared that people don't know, and that even a reporter with as much time on and as long a history in this state as Mike Donahue said, I didn't quite understand that the ending of overnight coverage discussed as long ago as June meant what you're saying it means now. And I'm going to look back and see the language that we used in June, because we have been saying this is where we're going if these staffing numbers happen for quite some time. But I want to task the police commission with close examinations of the real disparities that exist in our use of force and our arrest rates, things that we have to move forward on and address as an agency in order to improve and continue forward.
Thank you. And then just one clarification to the assessment that has not happened yet. I kind of sense some frustration on the department's part that hasn't begun. What needs to happen for that to happen? Why hasn't it happened, and how can it happen?
I'm not certain exactly. I don't know if Director Dodson wants to field that one, or.
Certainly, thanks, Chief. First, I would say in terms of frustration, I would imagine that it might be more accurate to say I think all parties who believe in the power of the assessment to give us information that's important would have liked it to begin earlier. It would have been better to begin earlier. And there are a number of reasons why it didn't. One of the reasons I might argue is just process. It was something that was moving through the council and the commission and the joint committee of those two bodies who were meeting over Zoom and trying to edit and manipulate a document in the context of public meeting rules. So there's a lot in the mix, and it just took longer than was ideal. But it's out, and we're receiving proposals from organizations who could do that. So I think everything's in place now. There'll be a process to choose a vendor, and then there has to be the working out with them about what they need in terms of setup to do it properly. So all that's going to take time. It seems very reasonable to expect that it will be mid-January to February at the earliest that all of that could take place, and it's actually underway. So that assessment, once again, to the degree that for those who believe that taking a data-based, scientific, experience-driven, expertise-driven look at our policing situation, the sooner we have that information, the better off we'll be. I do want to go back. I think that one of the challenges in this moment is one of conflation, perhaps, and having circumstances and things we're trying to achieve, and then perhaps jumping to the idea that those things achieve that. This is my personal opinion, informed by research I've done, conversations I've had. A lot of, I think, the scrutiny and concern was really set in motion and really amplified by the George Floyd situation and other such examples that have happened around the country with different agencies and different communities. And then a set of initiatives and actions as it results of looking at police came into effect. There's I think, a number of things in terms of reducing a force. I think there's the idea that there's more efficient deployment, and that is the idea that a expensive, long time frame, as the chief pointed out, highly trained officer with specific skills and specific tools, guns, batons, tasers, is sometimes not proportionate to the need in the community. I think everyone agrees with that. That's true. And so that's part of why we're looking at things. But I think also there's this sense that so many police are somehow that having a large number of police is related to the kind of racism and bias that we've seen around the country. And I think that's where there's perhaps a breakdown. The concern that I have as a community member, I do live in Burlington. I raised a family. I've got 3 sons in Burlington. Is the reality is I believe we will continue to have crime. We will continue to have things that require a response. And we will continue, probably, unfortunately, because of factors that are much bigger than the police, such as poverty and housing issues and food insecurity and job insecurity, all of which we need to address as a community. But I don't imagine we think those are all police department's responsibility. But there will probably be more crime and more behaviors that call for the intervention of the police in our vulnerable communities. And so my concern is that with reduction without the thoughtfulness that we might put to it, we're still going to have officers, they're still going to have guns, and they're going to have, even if they have a constrained set of parameters within which they can operate, they're going to be going into our community. And so if how the police interact with the community as it relates to race is the issue, I'm not sure how reducing automatically addresses that. What it can create is a beleaguered, resentful, bitter group of professionals who don't feel supported, but once again, are still doing the work and still interacting with our citizens. And for me, I will state clearly that that's not a better place to be for anybody, for all concerned, which is once again why I advocate for the thoughtfulness. The sense of whether the chief says we, reduce the or lessen the restrictions on hiring. I think there's a bunch of things we might do. As the chief points out, I think it's just fact that whatever we do is going to take some time because of the due diligence that's required. I think the community needs to weigh in on this, but I don't think necessarily that as we look at this and the number of police, we should see that as a rolling back or a lack of commitment to the changes that we wanted to make. I think it really is a response to the fact that, as always, the devil's in the details. There are logistics, significant and very complex logistics to how you staff a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week force with people who have lives. You try to create some consistency and you have people know when they're going to be doing things. You have people who have professional rights such as PTO. Unlike schools and other places, it's hard to get a substitute for a police officer. You cannot put a non-sworn resource into a sworn officer position. So the hands are tied when people get sick and other things happen in lives. People die, to go to funerals, all the things that happen to all of us in our jobs. It plays out very differently in a police force. And I think I'm just pointing out that as a civilian who went inside the police department, I did not know these things. I now understand these things better. And I think it's things we need to grapple with as a community because many of them are just facts. They are facts. And today's presentation for me is giving the community the facts it needs so that it can understand. And as we continue to go through this evolution and transformation, which I have seen and heard the chief say that he agrees that there's room for a transformation in the police department. We can just do it in a thoughtful and deliberate and informed manner.
Thank you.
And perhaps we have time just to clarify. Christina Guessford has asked to clarify Director Dodson's explanation on why a meeting with the mayor hasn't happened yet. Does he mean it could happen in January or February, or does he mean the 2-year plan could be implemented by then?
I'll speak to that, and then I'd love some other clarification. My understanding is the resolution and where we stand now was something enacted by the council. So the idea that Burlington go from 105 budgeted sworn officers to 74 budgeted sworn officers through a process of attrition was a resolution at the council. I don't believe single-handedly that the mayor, nor the chief, nor I has the authority to change that. So it will be community conversations about how we feel about the stress and the pressures on the police force, what that will mean to their ability to carry out services as they have historically without some new model, some new framework, some new structure defining how that work is done, one only has to either rely on precedent or rely on something that the chief and the deputies and their staffs unilaterally put together. There's no input currently, so they're thoughtful and they can put something together. It would not reflect the community's interest because the community would not be involved. They would just do what they thought could be done. So that's where we are. So we have to decide. That's, for me, the purpose of this press conference today is to take what was an internal conversation and make it a comprehensive community conversation about the pressures and stresses that currently exist and how we want to handle them. I think it's just as simple. And my understanding would be that the council, if there were going to be some change in how hiring, to the degree that hiring is part of what the community believes is important to address this now, then a communication or a conversation rather with the council would have to happen about how that gets addressed.
All right. Thank you, Director Dodson, for that. That is exactly what this is. This is the taking of an internal conversation that we have been addressing and contemplating as we see our staffing fall and making it into something that is more holistically participated in with our community, that we're bringing in as many voices as we can into this. Certainly the assessments are designed to do that as well. They haven't begun. And we are in a position now where we have to begin thinking about this because the numbers are falling and we are going to start making decisions that have a real impact on residents and businesses and anyone here in the Queen City. And so I think that was a terrific articulation of it. And I thank you for that. And I thank everybody who's here today. Deputy Chief Sullivan, did you?
Yes, I just wanted to add one thing. We have one of the most progressive, best trained agencies, I would argue, in the country, and we're certainly in Vermont. And one of the issues as our staffing levels fall is training requires staffing. And so in order to take officers, as you look at the shifts that you've been shown, in order to put officers in training, we have to take them off shifts and assign them to training, and we need to fill those gaps with other officers. And so that becomes increasingly more difficult. For example, this year, due to budget restraints, our officers are getting the bare minimum of training that we can provide them just to maintain their certification. So this is another thing to throw in the mix. Just one point in regard to the airport, I would say that taxes generally pay for police services. So depending on where those taxes are going, that is where police services are coming from. I don't know that South Burlington would have the capacity to do that. Certainly, an option might be available to contract with another law enforcement agency, such as the Sheriff's Department. But then it's interesting how that would dovetail with civilian oversight. The city is currently engaged in this process, examining civilian oversight for police services. And I don't know that it would accomplish that goal. It would certainly be much more complicated if you were contracting with an outside law enforcement entity in regard to civilian oversight over that entity. So there are a lot of complicated issues that might be associated with farming out police services at the airport.
I would like to point out, because we have it here, we're closing in on the end of a very difficult year for Burlington and the nation and the world. We just moved through and are, I believe, on the tail end of a national presidential transition that was something that was challenging for the community. I hope that viewers of this this press conference don't think of this challenge that we face as a sides, as a who's on what side, choosing sides sort of thing. There's only one community. It's one Burlington. It's not nearly as unified as I think, as I would hope we all want it to be, and there's reasons for that, and we're working on those things. But there's a lot of thought that went into this presentation, this sharing, and I would say these were the facts. The only editorial comment was when the chief was asked what he would do, and he said he would hire. But that's his personal answer to this challenge, which is here regardless of what he does. It was not created. This particular challenge was as a result of desire to diminish the size of the force and to think about new ways. And so we're here. The question about how we move forward together. And there are separate conversations I've stated in public letters, there's racism in the United States. It is well founded. And the Burlington PD exists within the United States. The chief and I have conversations. There are racial disparities in traffic stop data. There are other places that we're looking at to understand. And as the chief mentioned, there are things in place. So none of this negates the idea that that work needs to continue, but they are side by side. They're not either or. Side by side, while that work needs to happen, there's a real logistical fact that this is a complex department, it's a complex agency that does a complex, crucial service in our community, and it requires thought and resources to do the job. And now we're at a point where there's incredible strain on that, and we just have to decide what we want to do. While we continue to move forward with transformative work, there are things in the council that are part of that. There are lots of conversations, different things happening. But I hope we're able to see it as a both and, not either or, and some sort of tension or opposition that I don't think necessarily exists. I think there's much room for both and, not either or.
All right, thank you for that, Director Dodson, and thank you everybody for being with us today. Thank you for helping us take an internal conversation and move it out to Burlington. Thank you for helping us reach out to the 44,000 people who live in this city and who have not yet been part of this conversation, and who I'm hopeful are going to have some things to say about this and think about this, because these decisions are going to impact on the safety and the services that are provided for all of our 44,000 residents, as well as DC Lebrecht discussed, the thousands others who come in and who will be coming in again when this pandemic is over. It's a tough conversation. These are tough decisions to make. This is a tough position in which to be, but there are ways forward. And I'm hopeful that together and with as much input as possible, we can really think of ways forward that work for all of us and keep all of us safe. Thank you.